The night before the groundbreaking ceremony, my son called me in embarrassment. Not to my face, not in so many words, but through a text, cold, clean, calculated. Let's keep it formal tomorrow. No work gear, please. 10 words. No greeting, no dad, no thank you for decades of sweat, bruises, and blood. Just a polite knife wrapped in a corporate tone. A message meant to sound like style, but soaked in shame. I stared at the screen for a long time, and then I reread it again. And again. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. They didn't want the man who built the foundation to show up in the boots that built it. I sat alone at the kitchen table. My boots, old, cracked, still dusty from the site, rested by the door like loyal dogs. The same pair I'd worn through heat waves, thunderstorms, and back-breaking winters. The ones with the stitched patch from the day the steel toe saved me from a falling beam. The boots that knew the weight of every floor poured on that property, every hallway alignment, every underground line no architect ever sees. But apparently they weren't on brand. I glanced across the room at the mirror on the wall, the one my wife hung before she passed. In it I saw a man weathered by labor, not softened by it. Wrinkles earned from sunlight, not stress. Hands that shook less from age and more from holding too much for too long, without ever putting it down. And now this, my own son, the company's new visionary, didn't want me visible, because I wore what he called workwear. Because I didn't speak in pitch decks or sit on panels. Because I never cared about headlines. I just built the thing they're all trying to take credit for. The irony was sharp. I spent half my life building something I hoped would outlive me. And now that it no longer had room for me in it. The groundbreaking ceremony was tomorrow. The press would be there. Investors, officials, even the mayor. And yet no one had sent me an invitation. No mention of a seat, no space on the program. Just a backhanded text from a man who once ran barefoot through the site while I checked rebar. I was supposed to disappear politely, show up if I must, but look like a guest. Not the builder, not the father. Certainly not the man who drew the first lines with pencil on a plywood board in a garage that leaked when it rained. That night, I laid both pairs of shoes out by the door, a sleek, polished set I hadn't worn in years. And my boots, worn, stained, honest. And I knew. Tomorrow I wouldn't just choose what to wear. I'd be choosing whether to be seen or to stand. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't going to dress for them. I was going to walk in as me. Friends, let me take a short pause. Where are you listening from? Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong in something you helped build? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story speaks to your heart, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone you care about. That's how you help us grow this channel and continue telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. I came home that night with dust still clinging to my skin. Not metaphorical dust, real dust. From the concrete mix that didn't settle right this morning. From the insulation I adjusted with my own hands because no one else caught the misalignment. My shirt was damp with sweat, shoulders aching in that familiar way that comes after a good day's work. The kind that tells you did something real. But as I stood in the hallway, peeling off my gloves, I couldn't shake the weight of that message. 10 words, and all of them telling me not to show up as myself. I washed my hands in the sink, scrubbing under the nails, rubbing at the lines on my palms. But the calluses wouldn't fade, they never do. They were carved there by time, by commitment, by responsibility, by every promise I'd ever kept, to my workers, to my wife, to my son. I walked to the mirror, the same old mirror above the shoe bench where my boots always waited. I stared at my reflection. My face looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just more worn. Creased at the edges from years of squinting into sunlight, of trying to read blueprints under bad lighting, of looking out for others before myself. And in my hands I held them both. The polished shoes, expensive, barely worn, gifted by a client who wanted to elevate my image. Still stiff, still hollow, and beside them, my boots. Scuffed, split at the sole, familiar as a second skin. They smelled like earth, like labor, like truth. I stood there for a long time. No words. Just the quiet hum of the air vent and the sound of my own breathing. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me present, but silent. Visible, but unrecognizable. Decorative, like the commemorative plaques they hand out after you've been made irrelevant. They wanted to clean up my history so it wouldn't wrinkle the photo op. But you don't build a legacy in a boardroom. You build it knee-deep in mud. You build it with aching wrists and late-night emergency calls. You build it by staying late after the crew goes home, by fixing what others overlook, by carrying the weight when no one else is willing. And now they were asking me to hide it all, as if that man, the man in boots, wasn't worthy of standing on the ground he bled to prepare. I didn't cry. I haven't cried in years. But something in my chest twisted, sharp and deep. Because this wasn't just about shoes. It was about shame, about being told that dignity only counts if it's dressed properly, about being expected to trade in the evidence of a life well earned for something clean and silent. But here's the truth. I never built anything in silence. Not the company, not the site, not the home my wife and I raised him in. Everything I've ever built, it came from noise, from grit, from mess. And no matter what they wanted me to wear, I wasn't going to show up pretending I hadn't earned every scar. Because those boots, they weren't just what I wore, they were who I am. Long before there was a site to photograph, before permits were stamped and the ribbon cutting was marked on calendars, there was just a piece of paper, a rough sketch. Lines drawn by hand in pencil, erased and redrawn until they felt right. I remember that night clearly. The kitchen light was dim, and my wife had fallen asleep on the couch, still holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. I sat at the table with a ruler in one hand and a dull pencil in the other, staring at a blank sheet of graph paper that felt heavier than it should have. Because it wasn't just about buildings, it was about what it would mean. It was going to be more than concrete and walls. It was going to be a place that gave people purpose, a place where men could take pride in their hands, where a paycheck meant more than money, it meant dignity. I spent months working that plan, not in an office, not behind glass, but on the ground, with boots on, with blisters, with bandaged fingers and dirt under my nails. I learned every contour of that land. I knew how the soil shifted after rain. I knew where the sun hit hardest and when the wind turned brutal in winter. I knew because I didn't just direct others. I stood there with them. I poured the first mix with my own hands. I drove the forklift when no one else showed up. I patched the roof when the storm caved it in. And I made payroll by pawning my truck the month we almost didn't make it. But they forgot. Or maybe they never really knew. Because it's easy to overlook the man who's always working while you're posing. It's easy to forget the hands that lifted the weight when your only job was to carry the title. Now they called it his project. My son's. He spoke of it like it had been born in a conference room, like he'd envisioned it while sipping espresso in a modern office suite. He used phrases like, our corporate expansion, our next chapter, a monument to modern leadership. But this wasn't a monument, it was a memory, mine. I knew every steel beam like a scar. I remembered the order in which they were installed. I remembered which truck was late, which worker slipped on the wet rebar, which section had to be re-poured twice because the angle was off by half a degree. This place didn't start with a ceremony. It started with sacrifice. And not the kind that gets you a plaque or a quote in a press release. The kind that no one sees. The kind that wakes you at 3 a.m. because the weight of it won't let you sleep. The kind that makes your knees ache for weeks after the pour is done, and still you show up the next day anyway. They forgot that I didn't just pour concrete. I designed the foundation, with my hands, my pencil, my life. So no matter who holds the microphone tomorrow, no matter who cuts the ribbon for the cameras, no matter who claims the vision, the ground they're standing on, I drew it. I fought for it. I bled into it. This isn't just another project. This is mine. He was always a bright boy, quick with numbers, sharper with words. As a child, he would sit beside me in the workshop, legs swinging from the tall stool, asking questions I wasn't always ready to answer, about pressure systems, measurements, why men built things only to tear them down and start over again. He was curious, restless, ambitious. And I loved that about him. I thought, back then, that maybe, just maybe, one day he'd take this further than I ever could. That he'd walk through doors I built with my hands and speak in rooms where I never felt I belonged. I wanted more for him. Every father does. But somewhere along the way, more became instead. He stopped asking questions, stopped showing up on site, started trading steel-toed boots for polished shoes and blueprints for vision boards, and eventually he stopped calling it ours. Now it was his. I saw him on the local news last week, all charm and clean lines, talking to a reporter who had no idea where it all began. He stood in front of the new building, smiling with that practiced ease he'd learned from brand consultants and media training. "We're modernizing the family business," he said, taking it in a bold new direction. I watched from my living room, sitting on the couch I built from leftover lumber, surrounded by things made with hands, not money. He didn't mention the old days, didn't mention his mother, who used to hand out coffee to the workers when we couldn't afford a proper break room, didn't mention the nights I stayed awake doing the books by candlelight so we wouldn't default on payroll. He didn't mention me at all. Later that day he called, not to talk, but to manage. "About tomorrow, Dad," he said. "Let's keep the focus clean. There's going to be press, investors, donors. It might be better if you didn't stand near the podium. We want a unified image, not, mixed signals." Mixed signals, that's what I was now. A distraction. A smudge on the polished mirror of their brand. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like he was explaining something obvious, as if it were a small request, not a cutting away of everything I had poured into him. I didn't argue. What could I say? He had become the face of the company, the suit, the smile, the vision, and I, the man who built it, had been edited out of the picture. Still in the frame, maybe, but in the blurry background. And what hurt most wasn't that he wanted me gone from the spotlight. It was that he didn't even seem to know why I was ever in it. He thought the world began when the cameras showed up. But I remember when there wasn't even a front door to open. I remember when our brand was not a slogan, but a handshake. When our investors were neighbors. When our employees were friends who trusted me with their winters. He never laid a brick. Never swept a floor at midnight because we couldn't afford a cleaning crew. Never looked a man in the eye after handing him a pink slip we couldn't avoid. And now, here he was, claiming legacy with a borrowed voice. But legacy is not a spotlight. Legacy is the silence that stays when the lights go out. When the world forgets the man who built the foundation and only remembers the one who cut the ribbon. Still, I said nothing. Not because I agreed, but because I knew the ground beneath that podium, it remembers. And one day so would he. The envelope never came. I waited longer than I'd like to admit. At first I told myself it was just delayed, maybe a mailing error, maybe they were still finalizing the guest list. Maybe, just maybe, someone would knock on the door with a formal card and say, "We wouldn't dream of doing this without you." But by the 5th day I knew. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. No official invitation, no call, no polite email, not even a forwarded agenda, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't forget, it replaces, quietly, cleanly, professionally. I found out about the ceremony by accident. Luis, a welder I'd taken a chance on 12 years ago, was the one who called. I still remember the first day he came in for work, nervous, hands shaking, looking like he hadn't eaten in days. I didn't care about his resume. I cared that he showed up before sunrise the next day and never once complained when we asked him to stay late. That kind of loyalty mattered back then. It still matters now. "Boss," he said over the phone, "you coming tomorrow? Everyone's asking if you're speaking." My stomach sank. I didn't have the heart to tell him I hadn't been invited, that they were going to smile in front of cameras and thank investors, but not the man who laid the first chalk lines. "Figured you'd be front and center," he added with that same quiet loyalty in his voice. I didn't answer right away. I thanked him, told him I'd see what I could do, and then I sat in the dark for a long time. There's something uniquely hollow about realizing your absence has been choreographed, that you're not just missing from the picture. You were never meant to be in it. Not because you didn't matter, but because your presence makes people uncomfortable when they're trying to reinvent the story. I walked into the spare room, the one no one visits anymore. I keep boxes in there, blueprints, receipts, letters, a crumpled paper towel my wife once wrote on during a lunch break. "We're almost there. Keep going." I keep it pressed between 2 old manuals. It's stained, faded, and sacred. I pulled out the blueprint from Phase 1. I ran my fingers over the lines. Every angle, every measurement. The coffee stains on the corners. The grease smudge where I'd held a wrench too long before jotting down a correction. My son's initials were scribbled in one corner. He was just a kid then. He'd asked if he could sign something important. I let him. And now he was printing brochures that spoke of bold, new beginnings and fresh leadership. Words that sounded inspiring, but were sharpened beneath the surface. They didn't just forget where they came from, they rebranded it. I opened the old drawer of my desk and found a photograph. Black and white, curled at the edges, the groundbreaking of our very first sight. I was in the middle, surrounded by a crew that had borrowed boots, patched shirts, and eyes that knew hardship. We were smiling, not for cameras, but because we'd survived another week. That moment mattered. That man mattered. And yet tomorrow, they would take a shiny new shovel and push it into soil I had already broken. They'd pose, shake hands, give speeches about heritage and community, all while writing me out of the very history they were standing on. I closed the box, not with bitterness, with clarity, because now I saw it for what it was. This wasn't about formality. This wasn't about optics. This wasn't even about me being too old-fashioned. This was erasure, strategic, polite, efficient. They didn't want my story rewritten. They wanted it removed. But the truth about legacy is this. You can cut someone from the photo. You can remove their name from the brochure. You can exclude them from the speeches and the guest list. But you cannot erase what was built with hands. You cannot silence what still stands. And you cannot fake foundation. They thought I'd be too proud to show up uninvited. But pride has nothing to do with it. Tomorrow I will stand on that ground. With the same boots they asked me not to wear. With the same hands they asked not to see. And I won't ask for the mic. Because the man they tried to erase is the one who made the page they're printing on. And sometimes you don't need an invitation to return to what you already own. The house was quiet when I woke up. Too quiet. It had that strange stillness that only exists on days when something important is about to happen. But no one else knows it yet. The kind of quiet that hums under your skin and fills your chest before you even swing your legs over the side of the bed. The sun hadn't fully come up, just a faint gray light leaking in through the curtains. It painted everything in a soft silver haze, the kind of light that makes even old things look sacred. I moved slowly that morning, not because I was tired, but because I knew what today meant, not to them, to me. I made coffee, sat in the same chair I always did. The cushion sagged in the middle, shaped by years of early mornings and late nights. I didn't read the paper. I didn't scroll my phone. I just sat in silence and let the weight of the moment settle into me. On the table near the door sat two choices. The dress shoes, black, polished, almost new. My son bought them for me once, years ago, when he said I should look the part at corporate dinners. They'd barely been worn. They looked good, but they had no memory. And then beside them, my boots. Not just shoes, history, worn at the heel. Dried cement clinging to the soles, scars on the leather from nails, steel, and time. The stitching frayed in spots, but still holding, still whole. They'd been soaked through in rain, burned by sun, covered in snow. They had stood in silence while I held up collapsing beams, walked endless miles of foundation, and knelt beside workers to fix what no one else noticed. They were tired, but loyal. And they told the truth. I stood at the door, holding the laces in my hands, one in each fist, like a man trying to choose between pride and peace. The suit I'd laid out the night before hung neatly on the hanger, still smelling faintly of cedar. But something about it felt too clean, too rehearsed, like I was about to act in a story someone else had written. I thought about the podium, the cameras, the new sign they would unveil, the one that no longer carried my name. I thought about my wife, about how she would have smiled and told me to be kind but not small. She never liked when I shrank myself to make others more comfortable. She knew the cost of that. She'd watched me carry it for years. And I thought about my son, the boy who once begged to wear my hard hat on sight. The one who used to hold my hand and say, "One day I'll build something like you, Dad." And now, here we were. He'd built it, and asked me not to stand too close. I crouched and pulled the boots toward me. Not the new shoes, not the version of me they wanted for the press. The real ones. I laced them slowly, carefully, like I had 100 times before, but with more weight now. Not from age, but from memory. Every loop, every pull of the lace was a decision. I didn't wear those boots out of stubbornness. I wore them because they were the truth. And I was done apologizing for the man who built something real with his hands. When I stood up, I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't need to, because I already knew what I looked like. I looked like a builder. And today I was going to remind them that no matter how glossy the sign, you can't polish away the man who laid the first stone. When I arrived at the site, it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a showroom. Gone was the rawness, the scent of sawdust and damp soil, the buzz of real work in the air. In its place were temporary stages, velvet ropes, and rental potted plants, arranged to make the place look less like a construction zone and more like a gala. Everything was curated. Even the dirt had been raked flat. Not because it needed it, but because they wanted it to look clean for the cameras. I parked further back. No one guided me in. No one waved or offered a handshake. I was just another man in a crowd of shining shoes and perfect haircuts. A man who didn't belong to their version of the story. No one recognized me. Not the interns with clipboards, not the PR staff bustling past in black blazers with logos pinned to their chests. Not the photographers scanning the crowd for familiar faces, famous names, or expensive suits. Their eyes passed over me, quick and uninterested. I stood just beyond the marked perimeter, near the last unfinished edge of the foundation. The dirt was still real here, uneven, gritty, honest. I could see the marks left by the heavy machinery, the temporary boards still in place to protect the pipes underneath. It was the only part of the site that hadn't been scrubbed of its history. The rest of it? Stage managed. The executives stood near the platform, straightening their ties, practicing their smiles. They wore hard hats, not because they needed to, but because it looked good in photos. Their boots were spotless. One of them still had a sticker on the sole. You could tell they had never lifted anything heavier than a binder, but they stood tall, owning the space like royalty returning to their kingdom. They laughed in small circles, shared stories that sounded practiced, rehearsed, designed for applause. Every movement was intentional, every word calibrated. And there I was, standing quietly at the edge, in my worn boots and weathered jacket. The boots no one wanted to see, the hands no one wanted to shake. The man they'd rather crop out of the picture. I saw my son. He was front and center, the face of the future. Cameras flashed as he posed beside the donor plaque, beside city officials, beside men who once told me we'd never make it past the first phase. Now they clapped him on the back, lifted champagne flutes in his honor, repeated his slogans like scripture. Not one of them had ever swept a floor at 2 a.m. Not one had held a cracked pipe together with both hands while waiting for a part that never arrived. Not one had cried in their truck after laying off a man with 3 kids because the numbers wouldn't stretch another week. But here they were, center stage framed in gold. The spotlight belonged to them now. And I was the shadow they didn't want in the corner of the shot. But I didn't move, because I wasn't there for them. I was there for the ground. The same ground I measured with string and sweat. The same ground I bled on, laughed on, prayed over. Let them take their pictures. Let them smile and shine and sell their vision of history. Because no matter how polished the crowd, the dirt still remembers who broke it first. Just when I started to wonder if there was anything left of the real place we built, I saw them. Off to the side, away from the stage and the reporters and the champagne flutes, stood a small group of men. No name tags, no camera flashes, no polished shoes or slicked back hair. Just work coats, baseball caps, and hands that still bore the texture of labor. The old crew, men who'd swung hammers beside me, who'd eaten lunch off overturned buckets, who'd stood ankle-deep in freezing mud without complaint, because we had deadlines to meet and no room for excuses. Their backs were a little more bent now. Some had more gray in their beards, others moved a little slower. But the way they stood, steady, quiet, grounded, hadn't changed at all. They didn't need to wave when they saw me. They didn't call my name or point or make a scene. They just looked down at my boots and nodded, one by one. Not big nods, not exaggerated gestures, just small, simple, deliberate acknowledgments. The kind of gesture that means, I see you. I remember. I know what you gave. And in that moment, I felt more seen than I had in years. They didn't care that I wasn't on the program, that I hadn't been invited to speak, that I didn't have a seat or a microphone, because they knew that none of that was what gave a man his worth. They remembered the winters when we had no heat, and I brought blankets from home. They remembered the time I stood between them and an angry developer, shielding them from layoffs. They remembered how I stayed late, always last to leave, not because I had to, but because they did. We had built more than structures. We had built each other. And no ribbon, no plaque, no polished speech could touch that. One of them, Eddie, gave me a small wave. His hand was wrapped in an old brace, probably from the same injury he'd refused to take time off 4 years ago. Behind him was Thomas, who once drove 2 hours every day just to work for us because you're the only place that treats a man with dignity. Those men. They never cared about recognition, and neither did I. But in that nod, that quiet, weighty nod, was everything I needed. More than applause, more than a headline, more than a quote in a glossy press kit. Because respect, when it's real, doesn't shout. It doesn't need a stage or a spotlight. It stands in silence and holds your gaze. I looked back at them and nodded once in return. No words passed between us, none needed to. They had seen the boots, and that was enough. They knew what I had chosen that morning, what I was still choosing now, to stand not where it was easy, but where it was true. The suits on stage could have their speeches, but the men in the dirt, they'd already said everything that mattered. The music was soft and corporate. Violins piped through rented speakers, just loud enough to keep the silence from settling. The crowd had gathered now, pressed shoulder to shoulder in tidy rows, the kind of arrangement designed more for photographs than comfort. A white canopy flapped lightly in the breeze. The backdrop behind the podium bore the company's new slogan in bold lettering, with the word legacy underlined like they were trying to convince themselves they understood what it meant. Flashbulbs began to pop, phones raised, and then the voice came over the mic. My son. He stepped up with confidence, the kind you only carry when you think the hardest part of your story started with you. His suit was sharp, tailored, his hair styled with precision. Everything about him gleamed, the way they want their leaders to look, smooth, spotless, untouchable. He smiled at the crowd, at the investors and officials who had no idea where this all began. He opened with charm, a joke, laughter, applause. Then he started his speech. This moment marks a new era. He spoke of innovation, efficiency, market expansion, of sustainability, of tech-forward design, of modernization. He used words like scalability, impact, future-focused leadership, words that sound impressive but carry no dirt, no calluses, no weight. He called the project a vision, said it was born from bold ideas, that it stood on the shoulders of strong strategy. Not once did he say my name. He didn't mention the garage we started in, the winter our heating failed and we worked in gloves, the flood that nearly destroyed the framing and how we rebuilt it ourselves overnight. He didn't talk about the nights I slept in the cab of my truck outside the site, too exhausted to drive home, just to be first on the ground at sunrise. He didn't say my father. He said our founders, vague and safe. I stood at the edge of the crowd, boots planted firmly in the soil I knew better than my own backyard, listening to my own story being rewritten in pastels and polish. And it hit me then, not the anger, that had long burned out, but grief. Grief for a son who had once tugged on my arm and asked, "Can I help today, Dad?" Who used to build towers out of scrap wood and call them skyscrapers. Who once looked at my hands, rough and stained, and said, "I want hands like that when I grow up." Now he hid those same hands. Now he buried their story beneath scripted lines and bright lights. He talked about legacy like it was branding. But legacy isn't something you print on a banner. Legacy is the concrete under your feet that doesn't crack after the storm. And he forgot that. He finished to applause, loud and clean, the kind that bounces off polished surfaces but never sinks into the ground. People stood. Cameras flashed again. The mayor clapped. The donors smiled. And I stood in the back, invisible, yes, but rooted. Because even if he didn't speak my name, every word he said stood on top of the foundation I laid. Even if he couldn't see it, it was mine he was standing on. The applause hadn't even faded before it began. The golden shovels were passed out, polished, unused, more decoration than tool. Their handles gleamed under the mid-morning sun, untouched by dirt, untouched by labor. They handed one to each key stakeholder, each smiling executive, each public face of a project they hadn't actually built. My son took his last, still beaming, still soaking in the spotlight like it would keep him warm when history turned cold. They gathered at the front of the stage, lined up perfectly. The camera crew gave the countdown, 3, 2, 1, and the group raised their shovels in unison to break the ground. But something was wrong. I saw it before anyone else did. I knew the signs. The slight turn of my son's head, the quiet murmur to the event planner, the shuffle of feet as confusion settled in. The soil was too dry. The grass hadn't been cut properly, but more importantly, they weren't standing in the right spot. They were 2 full meters off the ceremonial marker, and there was no marker to guide them, because no one had asked where to dig. No one had thought to check. And why would they? They had consultants, spreadsheets, models, drone footage, all the glossy tools of modern leadership, but they didn't have the map, the one drawn from memory, from walking the land every day for years, from knowing how the sun fell in late summer, how the earth settled after heavy rain, how to shift the foundation by inches to avoid a frost swell that hadn't happened in 20 years, but might again. They didn't know the markers because they didn't set them, but I did. I remembered. I always remembered. I had measured them with my own hands, marked them in the dirt with a carpenter's pencil and a string line. The original grid, my grid, was buried now beneath layers of progress, but it still lived in me. I saw my son lean toward an assistant, whisper something. She scurried off and returned with a tablet. He looked down at it, brow furrowed, then looked at the ground. His smile faltered for the first time that morning. The others looked at each other. No one moved. They didn't know where to dig. The irony tasted bitter. All that planning, all that polish, all those words about vision, and no one knew where the ceremony was supposed to begin, because no one had bothered to ask the man who actually began it. For a moment, no one moved. The cameras waited, frozen mid-zoom. The mayor adjusted his collar. One executive laughed nervously. The line of polished shoes remained perfectly still, posed over soil that wasn't theirs to break, and then slowly all heads turned. Not in unison, not dramatically, but one by one, toward the edge of the crowd, toward me, the man in work boots, the man not on the program, the man who, somehow, still held the only map that mattered. I didn't speak, I didn't step forward. Not yet, because in that silence, in that moment of stillness and uncertainty, the truth finally surfaced. They had erased me from the narrative, but they couldn't erase the land, because the land remembers the hands that first touched it, and the ground, the real ground, would not let itself be broken by strangers, not until the one who set the markers told it where to yield. It was subtle at first, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, a glance, then a pause. Someone whispered. Another followed the line of sight, and suddenly, like gravity had shifted, the center of the ceremony moved, not by intention, but by instinct. They turned, not toward the stage, not toward the executives or the podium, but toward the edge of the crowd, toward me, the man in worn boots, dust on my sleeves, blueprints not in hand but in memory. I hadn't moved. I stood exactly where I'd been all morning, near the equipment fencing, beside a coil of temporary lighting cable, in the shadow of a project I had helped birth but had never been invited to raise. It was almost amusing if it hadn't been so heavy. All those suits, all those rehearsals, all that talk about vision. And now, here they were, cameras frozen, shovels still gleaming and unused, staring at a man they'd tried to edit out of the frame. Not out of hatred, out of discomfort, out of the quiet cruelty that comes when people think time makes them immune to gratitude. But now they needed something none of them had. Direction, because for all their planning, all their charts and consultants and branding teams, they didn't know where to put the shovel. But I did. I always had. Because before the project had a name, before the renderings and the brochures and the donor bricks, there was just land, raw and uneven, land I walked, measured, dreamed over, land I learned like a second language. I remembered every foot of it. The original ground line I marked with nothing more than a string and a spike, the way the southern edge dipped just slightly in winter runoff. The buried pipe we'd rerouted on a humid afternoon 12 years ago. The tiny oak sapling I'd insisted we move, not cut, because roots matter. And now, in the most public moment of the company's new era, all those roots had surfaced, and the men at the top had no idea where to dig. There was no ceremony without the land, and no land without the memory of how it had been shaped. My son stood still on the stage for a second, maybe less. Our eyes met. There was no anger in mine, just quiet understanding. And in his? For the first time, something that looked like humility. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because the silence in that moment said it all. No one had the measurements. No one had the layout, except me. Not because I clung to the past, but because I never let go of what mattered. There's a reason the foundation lives underground. because what holds everything up should never need the spotlight. It should simply hold. And now, when everything glossy failed, it was the boots they looked at. Not the titles, not the suits, the boots. Because deep down, even they knew, when it's time to break ground, you call the man who once knelt in the dirt, long before anyone showed up with golden shovels. I didn't plan to move. Not for show, not for recognition. But something in the silence cracked open, like the ground itself had grown impatient, waiting for truth. And so I did the only thing that made sense. I stepped forward, slowly, my boots pressed into the soil with a familiar weight, the same soil I had walked across in the early days with blueprints rolled under one arm and 1,000 worries pressed into my spine. Now, the earth seemed to welcome me back like an old friend. No questions, no conditions, just quiet acknowledgement. I passed the suits. They shifted as I walked by, uncertain whether to make space or pretend they didn't see me. Some stepped aside reflexively. Others looked down, caught between pride and the sudden realization that maybe they weren't standing on solid ground after all. I passed the cameras. Their lenses turned, whirring gently as they tracked me, unsure whether I was part of the show or a disruption to edit out later. The photographers hesitated. No one quite knew if they should keep shooting. This moment hadn't been rehearsed. I kept walking. My son stood still at the front, shovel in hand, lips parted like he had something to say, but no words had come fast enough. Behind him, the mayor leaned to one of the aides, whispering. The donors looked confused. A few guests checked their programs as if to confirm whether I belonged here at all. But I didn't stop. I didn't wait for someone to call my name. I didn't ask to speak. I didn't explain myself. Because when you build something, you don't need to ask for a place in it. I reached the platform, but I didn't step on it. I turned, boots grounded, eyes on the soil, and then I lifted my hand. I pointed to a simple bare patch of land just past the photographer's tents. No paint, no sign, no ribbon, just dirt, honest and unchanged, the true beginning. That was the spot, not marked on any of their diagrams, not polished for the press, but exactly where the foundation should be broken, the place I had measured once at sunrise years ago with nothing but a chalk line and gut instinct. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a murmur rose, low, confused, curious. My son looked toward the spot I'd indicated, then at me. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He just lowered his shovel, and slowly he walked off the platform, toward the dirt I'd pointed to. Others followed, reluctantly at first, then all at once, like gravity had shifted again. And I stepped back, because I wasn't there to take the mic. I was there to correct the course. To say, without saying it, this is where it begins. Not on a podium, not in a brochure, but in the earth, where every real story is written first, where truth doesn't ask for a spotlight, it simply waits to be returned to. And for the first time in that ceremony, they were finally standing, on the right ground. Something changed in the air. It wasn't loud, no announcement, no sudden applause, but it was there. A hush that wasn't scripted, a breath the whole crowd seemed to take at once. The silence cracked open, not with noise, but with understanding. The kind that doesn't come from being told. It comes from seeing what should have been obvious all along. Even the PR team, usually so composed and directive, stepped back. Their clipboards lowered, their earpieces went quiet. They stopped trying to manage the moment and just watched it, like everyone else, like something real had interrupted the presentation they were trying to control. And in the middle of that stillness, my son looked at me, not across a table, not through a camera lens, not as the face of a company, but as a son looking at his father. His eyes weren't proud. Not this time. They weren't smug or guarded, or filled with the polished assurance of someone who thinks success is measured in clicks or titles. They were softer, unsteady. There was a flicker of something in them I hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Maybe even regret. And behind that, something even deeper, remembrance. Of early mornings, he used to ride with me to the site in a truck that rattled like a tin can. Of the way I'd hold his hand crossing the gravel before it was paved. Of how I used to lift him up so he could see the layout on the wall, explaining, "This is where the office will be. Right here, buddy." He remembered. I could see it. All the stories he'd buried under board meetings and polished branding came back. Not in words, but in weight. And it hit him, right there in the middle of the ceremony, that none of this, none of it, had begun with a vision statement or a logo. It began with a man in worn boots, bent over the soil, dreaming with nothing but a pencil and a promise. He stepped away from the group. He didn't say anything, no speech, no apology, but he walked to the spot I'd pointed out, the true foundation, and he placed the ceremonial shovel into the dirt, slowly, with care, not for the cameras, for the ground. Then he looked back at me. Just a moment, just a glance. And in that silence, I heard everything he couldn't say. You were right. I forgot. I remember now. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Because sometimes the greatest shift happens without a sound. And in that one look, in the soft collapse of pride and the quiet rising of humility, something was rebuilt between us. Not the company, not the legacy. And it didn't need a blueprint. It just needed truth to finally be seen again. I didn't plan to touch the shovel. I hadn't come for that. I came to stand, to witness, to remind. But sometimes the moment asks for more. And when it does, you answer, not for show, not for pride, but because something inside you says, this is yours. Finish it. I saw the hesitation in my son's hands. He was still holding the shovel where I'd pointed. The tip hovered above the soil, waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. For approval, for permission, for something to lift the weight of knowing he'd forgotten what mattered, and now wanted to remember. He looked at me again, then lowered his eyes, and without a word he offered me the handle. Not ceremonially, not for the crowd, but because in that moment even he knew, you don't break ground with ego. You break it with reverence. My hands wrapped around the shaft of that polished shovel, the gold-plated finish cold beneath fingers shaped by decades of splinters, steel, frostbite, and time. It felt wrong in some ways, too clean, too perfect. But the ground beneath it, the ground I knew, was real. So I did what I had done 1,000 times before. I stepped forward. I pressed the tip into the soil. Firm, deliberate. And then I dug. The cameras clicked, not like before, not in a frenzy, not out of obligation. This time they clicked because they knew. They were capturing a moment no press release could write, no speech could manufacture. It wasn't about the golden shovel. It wasn't about the photo op. It was about truth returning to its place. The soil split with the kind of sound only I would hear. The memory of the first dig, the first pour, the first prayer, whispered into wet concrete under an early morning sky. The same prayer I said every time we started something new. Let it hold, let it last, let it mean something. I lifted the earth with that single motion, just a small scoop. But the weight of it, it was everything. Behind me there was silence, not out of awkwardness, but out of respect. Even the PR team had lowered their phones. The photographers, for once, weren't directing anything. They simply watched, because this was the moment they'd all tried to plan for, but couldn't create. This was the real groundbreaking, not the show, not the ribbon, not the speech, but the act of hand meeting earth, of legacy returning to the soil it sprang from, of a man, once forgotten, now remembered, not with applause, but with understanding. My son stood just behind me, his eyes glassy, his shoulders dropped, no longer in posture, but in posture's absence, in humility. He didn't say a word. But I felt him beside me, not as a leader trying to take charge, not as the heir to a company, but as a boy again, watching his father show him how it begins. And maybe, just maybe, he realized something. That legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you kneel for, bleed for, build from the ground up. And on that day, with one shovel of soil, everything started again. Not the project, but the truth. Because the foundation had never been concrete or steel. It had always been honor. And finally, we were standing on it again. A few days later, the coverage started rolling out. Headlines, blog posts, interviews. All the polished words they always use to make something look bigger, shinier, more intentional than it really was. A new era begins, one title read. Another called it The Future of Family Business. Legacy meets innovation. There were quotes from donors, applause for leadership, a few neatly edited sound bites from the mayor. I wasn't mentioned. Not once. There was no line about the man who laid the original foundation. No quote, no name, not even a passing thank you. The press releases told a story where the building began with branding, where the history started when the cameras rolled. And honestly, I thought that would bother me more than it did. But it didn't. Because a few pages in, buried among the glossy photos of champagne flutes and ribbon scissors, was a single frame that told the truth louder than any paragraph ever could. A shovel, mid-motion, slicing into the dirt, and beside it, just slightly off-center, caked in dry mud, scarred at the seams, worn at the heel, were my boots. They hadn't meant to capture me. The photographer probably didn't even notice at the time. It wasn't posed. No one was smiling. There was no stage behind it, no marketing backdrop, no spotlight. Just a moment. Real. Unfiltered. And beneath the photo, a simple caption, built by hand, led by heart. I stared at that picture for a long time, longer than I expected, because in that image there was no ego, no agenda, just memory, just soil, just truth. Those boots had walked through every version of this place, through drought and flood, through concrete dust and drywall debris, through meetings where I was outvoted and mornings where I showed up before anyone else. They had stood for hours without rest. They had stepped back when others needed the spotlight, and when everyone else forgot where it all began, they had kept walking. Quiet, steady, unshaken. They didn't show my face. But it didn't matter, because those boots were mine. And anyone who'd ever swung a hammer, carried a load, stayed late, or bled for something that mattered, they knew. They knew whose story that was. A week later, the photo was framed and hung in the new building's entrance. Not on the main wall. Not beneath spotlights, but tucked into a side hallway, near the original support beam we'd reinforced 3 times to keep from collapsing during the early expansion years. No plaque. No explanation. Just the image, quiet and strong. And every now and then, I heard someone pause in front of it and ask, "Who's that?" And someone would answer, "That's the founder. That's where it all started." Not because a script told them to say it. Because truth has a way of staying in the room long after names are forgotten. I wasn't in the speech. But now I was in the story. Exactly where I had always belonged. Not above it, not ahead of it, but beneath it. In the foundation. Where all real things live. Where the dirt tells the truth. Where boots leave their mark and never ask for permission to stay.